At my 63rd birthday party, my son Scott lifted his champagne glass and smiled like a man unveiling a gift I had asked for. "Tonight," he said, voice warm enough to fool the room, "we celebrate my mother's birthday and her retirement." Laughter fluttered around me. My fingers went cold around my napkin. I had never agreed to retire, never even discussed it. Then just as I turned to look at him, I heard a sharp crash behind me, glass shattering across the floor, and the whole room seemed to flinch at once. I didn't know it yet, but that was the sound of my life splitting open. If this opening pulled you in, take a moment to like and subscribe. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own child made a life-changing announcement for you in front of a room full of people? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight. If you had asked me that morning what I expected from my birthday, I would have said something simple. A room full of familiar faces, laughter that didn't feel forced, maybe a quiet moment where I could look around and think, "Harold, we did something good with this life." Instead, I stood there with my son's words echoing in my ears, her retirement, and realized I might have been the only person in that room who didn't know what the evening was truly about. I'm Edna Franklin. I turned 63 that night. And for 35 of those years, I built something with my husband that I never once thought would become a point of negotiation between me and my own child. Harold and I started our business in a garage behind our first home here in Savannah. We didn't have investors. We didn't have a polished plan. What we had were folding tables, borrowed inventory, and a willingness to say yes to jobs bigger than we were ready for. Weddings, church banquets, corporate luncheons, we supplied chairs, linens, staging, anything people needed to gather and celebrate. There were nights we loaded trucks until our hands ached. Mornings we woke up before sunrise to deliver orders ourselves, and months where we weren't sure we'd make payroll, but we did. Slowly, steadily, the company grew. We hired staff. We moved into a warehouse, then another. By the time Harold passed away 8 years ago, Franklin Event Supply wasn't just a business, it was a name people trusted. After he died, everyone asked if I would sell. I didn't, because letting go of that company would have felt like letting go of him. So I stayed. I worked. I adjusted. I learned to lead alone. And for a long time, I believed Scott understood that. My son used to be the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late, not because I asked him to, but because he cared. He had Harold's patience, or so I thought. He listened more than he spoke. When he first started helping with the company, I was proud of how he treated our staff with respect, with humility. But something shifted over the past year. At first it was subtle. Scott started talking differently. Less about people, more about structure. Less about relationships, more about efficiency. Words like transition, long-term sustainability, and leadership realignment began slipping into everyday conversations. "Mom," he would say gently, "you've carried this company for decades. Don't you think it's time to think about stepping back?" I would smile and tell him I was stepping back, just not disappearing. There's a difference, you know. One is a choice. The other is a replacement. Vanessa, his wife, entered those conversations not long after. She had always been polite with me, attentive in a way that felt almost rehearsed. She liked to frame things as concern. "You deserve peace, Edna," she told me once over tea, her hand lightly brushing mine. "You've done more than enough. It's time to think about your legacy." Legacy. It's a beautiful word when it's yours. It's unsettling when someone else starts defining it for you. I remember the first time I felt truly uncomfortable. It was during a visit to my doctor's office after I had a brief dizzy spell. Nothing serious, just dehydration and stress, the kind that sneaks up on you when you forget to take care of yourself. Scott insisted on driving me. He sat in on the appointment asking questions I hadn't thought to ask. At the time, I told myself it was love. A son worrying about his mother. Now standing in that party with his voice still lingering in the air, I wondered if that moment had meant something else entirely. The music started up again around me, soft jazz filtering through the room as guests tried to recover the celebratory mood Scott had so carefully set. People smiled, but it wasn't the same kind of smile as before. There was curiosity now, a quiet, watchful energy. I took a slow breath and looked around more carefully. That's when I began to notice the details. Some of my longest-serving employees weren't there. Renee, my operations manager, who had been with us for nearly 15 years, absent. A few of our warehouse supervisors also missing. Instead, I saw faces I didn't recognize. Well-dressed men and women clustered near Scott and Vanessa, speaking in low tones, holding themselves like people used to boardrooms rather than banquet halls. One man shook Scott's hand with a kind of measured approval. Another leaned in, speaking quietly, his eyes flicking toward me before looking away. I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't just a birthday party. It was curated. Even the way the room was arranged seemed different. The cake table wasn't just decorated with flowers and candles. Behind it stood a large display board, something I had barely noticed when I first walked in. I took a step closer. There were photographs, older ones. Harold and me in our early years. The first warehouse. Our first full team standing in front of a delivery truck. Moments of growth of pride. And beside those photos in elegant script were 2 words. Next chapter. My chest tightened. No one had asked me if I was ready for a next chapter. No one had even told me we were turning the page. "Isn't it beautiful?" Vanessa's voice appeared beside me, smooth as silk. I turned slowly to face her. She smiled, her expression warm, but her eyes were measuring something. "We wanted to honor everything you've built," she continued. "Tonight is really about celebrating you and what comes after. What comes after," I repeated, keeping my voice even. Her smile didn't falter. "Rest," she said softly. "Freedom. Time for yourself. Time for myself." As if the life I had built had been some kind of burden I needed to be freed from. Before I could respond, Scott approached, slipping an arm lightly around Vanessa's back. "There you are, Mom," he said, his tone light, easy. We were about to continue the toast. Continue. As if it had never been interrupted. As if I had agreed to everything he had just announced. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the confidence in his posture, at the way he stood slightly in front of me, not beside me, at the subtle expectation that I would follow his lead. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for me to realize that whatever was happening in that room, it had not started tonight. And if I didn't start paying attention, it wouldn't end here either. I forced a small smile, the kind that reveals nothing. "Of course," I said. "Let's continue." But as I turned back toward the crowd, I made a quiet decision. I would not react yet. I would watch. I would listen. And I would find out exactly what my son had already decided for me. Because one thing was suddenly very clear, that party wasn't about celebrating my life. It was about rewriting it. When Scott lifted his glass again, the room obeyed him. That was the first thing I noticed. Not just that people listened, but that they adjusted. Conversations softened. Laughter faded into polite silence. Even the band seemed to lower their volume without being told. Control. That's what it felt like. "Let's try that again," Scott said with an easy chuckle, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Tonight is about honoring someone who gave everything she had to her family, to this company, to all of us." There was applause. Warm, practiced. I stood a few feet away from him, hands loosely clasped in front of me, my face calm in a way that surprised even me. Inside, something was tightening, like a thread being pulled slowly, deliberately toward a breaking point. Scott continued. "My mother built something extraordinary," he said, gesturing toward the display board. "And now she deserves the chance to enjoy the life she's worked so hard for." He paused, letting the sentiment settle. To rest, he added, to step away with dignity, knowing everything she created is in good hands. A few people nodded. Someone murmured, "Hear, hear." I didn't move, because what he was offering me wasn't rest. It was removal. Vanessa clinked her glass gently against his, her smile bright, her posture composed. She looked at me briefly, just long enough to gauge my reaction. I gave her nothing, but I saw everything. The way her eyes flicked toward a table near the cake, the way Scott followed that glance just for a second. And then I looked too. There, arranged neatly beside the floral centerpiece, were several slim folders, cream-colored, professional, the kind of folders that don't belong at birthday parties. I took a slow breath. This wasn't just symbolic. It was procedural. Scott raised his glass higher. "So tonight," he said, voice steady, "we don't just celebrate the past. We welcome the future." More applause. But it felt thinner this time, less certain, because people were starting to sense something, maybe not the truth, but the imbalance. The way this moment didn't quite fit the setting. "Mom," Scott said, turning toward me with a smile that was meant to look affectionate, "would you like to say a few words?" There it was, the invitation, or maybe the expectation. I could feel every eye in the room shift toward me, waiting, watching, measuring. For a split second, I considered playing along, smiling, thanking everyone, letting the moment pass so I could deal with it privately later. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Scott had already spoken for me. Maybe it was the word retirement hanging in the air like a decision already made. Or maybe it was that quiet, stubborn part of me, the same part that had carried me through years of uncertainty, loss, and rebuilding, that refused to be gently pushed aside. I stepped forward. Just one step. Actually, I said, my voice steady, I wasn't aware I was retiring. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. A few people glanced at each other. Someone cleared their throat. The kind of small human reactions that ripple when something unscripted breaks through a polished surface. Scott's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. Just slightly, a fraction tighter at the corners. "Well," he said lightly, "we've talked about it, Mom." "No," I replied, still calm, still measured. "You've talked about it." Silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Vanessa stepped in quickly, her tone soft, smoothing over the tension like a practiced host. "Edna, sweetheart," she said gently, "we just wanted to create a moment for you. Something special. Something meaningful." Meaningful. I looked at her, at the careful warmth in her voice, at the way her hand hovered near my arm as if ready to guide me physically if needed, and I realized something then. This wasn't improvisation. This was choreography. Every word, every smile, every pause. Scott took a small step closer to me, lowering his voice just enough that it sounded intimate, but not enough to escape the ears of those nearest to us. "We can talk about the details later," he said. "Right now, let's just enjoy the night. Enjoy the night." as if I hadn't just been publicly repositioned in my own life. Before I could respond, movement caught my attention again. Near the back of the room, one of the catering staff, young Slim. Her dark hair pulled into a neat bun was being quietly guided away by another employee, Tessa. I recognized her now. She had been the one who dropped the glass, but it wasn't the broken glass that held my attention. It was her face. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was scared. Her eyes were wide, her breathing uneven, and as she turned just for a second, her gaze locked onto mine. There was something in that look. Not apology, not exactly. It was urgency, a silent, desperate kind of communication that didn't belong in a room like this. And then she was gone, led through a side door and out of sight. "Accidents happen," Vanessa said smoothly, following my line of sight. "We'll take care of it." Of course they would. They were taking care of everything tonight. I looked back at the cake table, at the folders, at the next chapter display, at the people who were beginning to whisper quietly to each other, unsure whether to celebrate or observe. And then I looked at my son, really looked, at the confidence in his stance, at the certainty in his expression, at the assumption so deeply rooted it barely needed to be expressed that I would eventually fall in line, that I would smile, that I would accept, that I would make this easy for him. A strange calm settled over me. Not peace, not yet, but clarity, because in that moment I understood something important. This wasn't just about a speech. It wasn't even about retirement. It was about control, about timing, about presenting a version of reality so complete, so polished, that by the time I objected, it would already be too late. I forced a small, polite smile. "For now," I said quietly, just loud enough for Scott and Vanessa to hear, "I think I'll pass on the speech." Scott studied me for a moment. Just a moment, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. Then he nodded. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you're comfortable with." Comfortable. That word again. Vanessa gave my arm a light, reassuring squeeze before stepping back. "Let's get everyone some cake," she said brightly. "No reason to let the night lose its sweetness." The band picked up the music again. Conversations restarted. Laughter returned, but it was different now, thinner, careful, and I stepped back into the crowd, my smile still in place, my posture steady. But inside, everything had shifted. Because I knew two things now with absolute certainty. First, that this night had been planned long before I arrived, and second, that the girl who broke that glass hadn't been careless. She had been trying to interrupt something important enough to risk drawing attention, something dangerous enough to make her afraid. And if I wanted to understand what my son had set in motion, I needed to find her. I waited exactly 6 minutes. Not because I was calm, but because I needed to look calm. In a room like that, full of watching eyes and carefully arranged narratives, panic was a luxury I could not afford. So I stood near a cluster of guests I barely knew, nodded at the right moments, even let out a soft laugh once or twice when someone made a joke I didn't hear. All the while, I kept my attention fixed on the hallway where I had last seen Tessa disappear. When the moment felt right, when Scott was pulled into conversation by one of the men in suits, and Vanessa was busy directing the staff near the cake, I slipped away. The hallway was quieter than the main room. The music softened to a distant hum. I followed it past the restrooms, past a small service door, until I reached the powder room tucked into the corner. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. For a second, I just stood there, gripping the edge of the marble sink, staring at my reflection. 63. Not fragile, not fading, not someone who needed decisions made for her. "Get yourself together, Edna," I whispered. A soft knock answered me. I froze. Another knock, quieter this time. "It's me," a small voice said through the door. "I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go." "Tessa!" I exhaled slowly, crossed the room and unlocked the door. She slipped inside, quickly closing it behind her like someone afraid of being followed. Up close, she looked even younger than I had thought, mid-20s at most. Her hands were trembling, her eyes darting to the door, then back to me. "I'm so sorry about the glass," she said immediately. I didn't mean to make a scene. You did mean to," I said gently. She stopped. Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching in her throat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply watched her. And after a moment, the truth surfaced in her expression. "Yes," she whispered. Silence settled between us. Outside, faint music drifted through the walls, a reminder that the party was still happening, that the version of reality Scott had created was continuing without interruption. Inside that small room, something much more honest was unfolding. "What did you hear?" I asked. Tessa swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor before lifting again. "I wasn't trying to eavesdrop," she said quickly. "I was just taking a tray out to the patio and I heard voices. I recognized her voice, your daughter-in-law's, and there was a man with her." "Vanessa," I said quietly. She nodded. "And the man I asked?" "I don't know his name," she said. "Tall, dark suit, kind of intense." "Derek," I thought immediately. "Go on." Tessa took a breath, steadying herself. "They were arguing," she said. "Not loud, but tense, like they were trying not to be overheard. And she kept saying things like," she hesitated as if choosing her words carefully, like, "It has to happen tonight," and "We don't have another clean opportunity like this." My chest tightened. And then the man said something about paperwork, about needing everything signed while everyone important is still here. My fingers curled slightly against my palm. "Did you hear anything else?" I asked. She nodded again, more slowly this time. She said, "Once the doctor's note is referenced, she won't push back in front of people." The words landed harder than I expected. She won't push back. As if I were predictable, manageable, containable, and then Tessa's voice dropped even lower. She said, "We just need her to sign before she starts asking questions." The room seemed to tilt for a second, not from confusion, but from confirmation. Everything I had felt, every small discomfort, every dismissed instinct was suddenly real. "And that's when you dropped the glass," I said. Tessa nodded, her eyes shining now. "I panicked," she admitted. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should tell someone or pretend I didn't hear anything. But then I saw them coming back inside and I thought, if something is supposed to happen tonight, maybe I can stop it. Even just for a minute." So she had. She had shattered a glass in a room full of people just to create a pause, just to interrupt a moment she didn't fully understand, but knew was wrong. "You were brave," I said quietly. Her eyes widened slightly. "I didn't feel brave," she said. "I felt like I was about to get fired." Despite everything, a small, unexpected smile touched my lips. "Well," I said, "if anyone has a problem with you tonight, they can take it up with me." She let out a breath that sounded almost like relief, though the tension hadn't fully left her shoulders. "I didn't know if I should come tell you," she continued. But the way they were talking, it didn't sound like a surprise. It sounded like something already decided. "It was," I said. And hearing myself say it out loud made something inside me settle into place. Not peace, but certainty. I walked back to the sink and rested my hands against the cool marble again, my mind moving quickly now, connecting pieces that had once seemed unrelated. Doctor's note. Sign tonight, before she starts asking questions. They think I won't question it, I murmured. Tessa didn't respond. She didn't need to. Did you see any papers? I asked, turning back to her. She shook her head. No, but when they came back inside, I saw your son go straight to the cake table. There were folders there already. Of course there were. Prepared. Positioned. Waiting. For me, I said. Tessa hesitated. I think so, she said softly. A knock sounded faintly from somewhere down the hall, followed by a voice calling out for staff. Tessa flinched. I should go, she said quickly. If they notice I'm gone, they won't, I said more confidently than I felt. And if they do, I'll handle it. She paused at the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle. I'm sorry, she said again. For what I asked. For being part of this, she said, glancing toward the direction of the party. Even if I didn't know. I shook my head. You're not part of it, I said firmly. You're the reason I know what's happening. Her eyes met mine again, this time not with fear, but with something steadier. Then she slipped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. I stood there alone for a moment longer, listening, thinking, breathing. Then I reached for the door, unlocked it, and stepped back into the hallway. The music grew louder as I walked toward the main room, the hum of conversation rising to meet me. Laughter, clinking glasses, the soft rhythm of a celebration that on the surface had never been interrupted. Vanessa spotted me first. Of course she did. Her smile returned instantly, warm and composed as she made her way toward me. There you are, she said, her tone light. I was just about to come check on you. I'm fine, I replied evenly. I'm glad, she said, her eyes searching my face. We were thinking, maybe after cake we could all sit down for a few minutes. There are just a couple of small things we'd like to go over. Nothing stressful. Nothing stressful. While everyone's here, she added gently, there it was. The moment. The plan. The pressure point. I looked at her. At the woman who had just hours ago spoken to me about peace and legacy, and now I saw her clearly, not as a daughter-in-law, not as family, but as someone executing a strategy. And I smiled. Of course, I said. Her expression brightened, relief flickering across her face before she could hide it. Wonderful, she said. I knew you'd understand. Oh, I understood. Far more than she realized, because now I knew exactly what they wanted from me. And more importantly, I knew they needed it tonight, which meant I still had time. Time to watch. Time to think. Time to decide how this night was going to end, because one thing had changed completely in the last 10 minutes. Before I had been reacting. Now, I was paying attention. I didn't go straight back to the center of the room. Instead, I drifted along the edges past clusters of guests and small islands of conversation, letting the noise of the party wrap around me like a disguise. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray, not because I was thirsty, but because I needed something in my hand, something to steady me. Inside, everything was moving faster now. Tessa's words kept replaying in my mind. Sign tonight. Doctor's note, before she starts asking questions. They didn't sound like possibilities, they sounded like instructions. I paused near the dessert table, pretending to admire the arrangement while my eyes slid toward the cake display again. The folders were still there, neatly aligned, untouched, waiting. For me, I moved closer, careful not to draw attention. Vanessa was across the room speaking with one of Scott's business contacts. Scott himself was engaged in conversation near the bar, his posture relaxed, his expression confident. They thought they were ahead of me. That thought alone gave me just enough space to act. I reached the table, picked up a small plate, and in the same motion let my hand brush against one of the folders. It slid just slightly toward me enough. I opened it halfway. Not fully. Not obviously. Just enough to see. The paper inside was crisp, formal, stamped with a legal header. I caught phrases. Temporary executive authority, operational transition, health-related considerations. My pulse thudded in my ears. I turned the page just a fraction more. There it was. A section referencing my recent medical evaluation. No diagnosis listed. No specifics. Just carefully chosen language vague enough to imply concern, firm enough to justify action. It wasn't a lie. It was something worse. It was a suggestion dressed as fact. I closed the folder slowly and returned it to its exact position. No one seemed to notice. But everything inside me had shifted again. Because now, I knew. They weren't planning to forge anything outright. They were building a narrative. One that would make resistance look unreasonable. One that would make me look unreasonable. I stepped away from the table, my movements measured, my breathing controlled. And then the memories started lining up, one after another. Not new memories, just ones I had ignored. There was the call from the bank 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Franklin, the man had said politely, "We're just following up on the transition planning discussed with your son." At the time, I had assumed it was a misunderstanding. "I'm not transitioning anything," I had replied. There had been a pause, then a smooth recovery. Of course, just routine confirmation. I hadn't thought about it again, until now. Then there was the conversation with my office assistant, Claire. She had mentioned almost casually that someone had requested copies of older company records documents tied to our early structure ownership and authority. Scott said it was for organization, she told me. I had nodded. Because that's what you do when you trust someone. You accept the explanation that's easiest, even when something in you hesitates. And then there was the doctor's appointment. That moment returned more clearly now than it had in months. I had felt lightheaded that morning. Nothing dramatic, just the result of skipping meals and pushing myself too hard. Scott had insisted on taking me in. He had sat beside me the entire time, listened carefully, asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. Could this be related to cognitive strain, he had said at one point. The doctor had smiled kindly. "No, not at all," she replied. "This is dehydration and stress. Very common. She just needs to rest and stay hydrated." That should have been the end of it. But it hadn't been for Scott. Afterward in the car, he had gone quiet, then thoughtful, then persistent. "Maybe we should keep an eye on things," he said. Just in case. At the time I had seen concern. Now I saw groundwork. A seed planted early. Not for my sake, but for a story he intended to tell later. I exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper. This hadn't started at the party. It hadn't even started recently. It had been building, layer by layer. Conversation by conversation, suggestion by suggestion, until it became something that could be presented not as a sudden decision, but as a natural next step. A reasonable one. I moved toward the far side of the room where a few older guests were seated, speaking softly among themselves. One of them, Mrs. Callahan, reached for my hand as I approached. "Edna, dear," she said warmly. "What a beautiful evening." "Thank you," I replied, forcing a gentle smile. "You must be so proud," she added. "Scott speaks so well, so confident." "Confident." Yes, I said quietly. He does. She squeezed my hand. And retiring at the right time is a gift, you know, she continued. Not everyone gets to choose it. I held her gaze for a moment. Choose it? I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. It is, but inside something hardened, because I hadn't chosen anything. They were choosing for me, and they were doing it in a way that made it look like my idea. That was the most dangerous part. Not the paperwork, not the timing, but the perception. If enough people believed this was my decision, then opposing it would make me look unstable, emotional, uncertain. Exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be in charge. I glanced across the room again. Scott was laughing now, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke. Vanessa stood nearby, attentive, engaged, reinforcing every word he said with subtle nods and affirming smiles. They were already stepping into their roles, as if the transition had already happened, as if I were simply the last piece that needed to fall into place. A strange calm washed over me, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that comes from understanding, because once you see the structure of something clearly, it loses some of its power over you. I turned slightly, scanning the room again. The guests, the staff, the carefully chosen witnesses, and I realized something else. They didn't just want my signature. They wanted it here, tonight, in front of people who would remember it, who would later say I was there. She agreed. She seemed fine. That was the real trap. Not the documents, but the moment. I straightened my shoulders, adjusting my posture almost unconsciously. 35 years of building a business had taught me one thing above all else: timing matters. And if someone is rushing you, it's because time is the one thing they don't want you to have. I let my gaze settle on Scott one last time. My son, the boy I had raised, the man who now believed he could rewrite my life in a single evening. I felt the weight of that truth press against my chest, but it didn't break me. Not anymore, because now I wasn't standing in confusion. I was standing in awareness, and that changed everything. Vanessa caught my eye from across the room and smiled again, a subtle gesture inviting me back into the center of things, back into the plan. I smiled in return, small, controlled, unrevealing, and I began to walk toward her. Not because I was ready to agree, but because I was ready to see just how far they were willing to go. I found Scott in my husband's study. The door was half closed, just enough to suggest privacy without drawing attention. That too felt intentional. Nothing about this night was careless. For a moment I stood outside, my hand resting lightly against the wood, letting the quiet settle around me. The music from the party drifted faintly through the walls, laughter glasses clinking, the soft hum of a celebration that had already decided its ending. Then I pushed the door open. Scott looked up immediately. "Mom," he said, surprised, but only slightly. "I was wondering where you went." Of course he was. He had been keeping track of me. The study hadn't changed much since Harold passed. His desk was still in the same place, polished to a quiet shine. The framed photograph of the three of us, taken years ago when Scott was still young enough to lean into me without hesitation, sat in its usual spot. For a brief second, that image hurt more than anything else that night. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "We need to talk," I said. Scott leaned back against the edge of the desk, his posture relaxed, his expression open in a way that would have reassured anyone who didn't know him as well as I did. "Of course," he said. "What's on your mind?" I studied him. Really studied him. The calm, the confidence, the expectation that this conversation would follow a certain path. "You told a room full of people that I'm retiring," I said evenly. He nodded as if that were a perfectly reasonable place to start. "We've discussed it," he replied. "No," I said. "You've mentioned it." "That's not the same thing." A flicker crossed his face. Small, but real. "Mom," he said, his tone shifting just slightly softer, more deliberate. "This doesn't have to be a conflict." There it was. The reframing. Not what he had done, but how I was reacting to it. I took a slow step closer. "Then tell me," I said, my voice still calm, "what exactly you expected to happen tonight." Scott exhaled quietly as if preparing himself. "I expected you to let people celebrate you," he said, "to acknowledge everything you've accomplished, and to accept that it's time for the next phase." "The next phase," I repeated. "Yes." "And what does that look like?" I asked. His jaw tightened just slightly before he answered. "It looks like you stepping back from day-to-day operations," he said, "letting me take on a more formal leadership role, making things official." "Official." "So that's what the folders are for," I said. He didn't react immediately, but his eyes sharpened. "You looked at them," he said. "I saw enough," I replied. Another pause. Then a shift. Subtle but unmistakable. The warmth in his expression cooled. The ease in his posture straightened into something more controlled. "You weren't supposed to see those yet," he said. "Yet. Not if. Not at all. Just not yet." "That's interesting," I said quietly, because from where I was standing it looked like I was supposed to sign them in front of a room full of people. Scott shook his head, a small dismissive gesture. "That's not what this is," he said. "You're misunderstanding the situation." "Then explain it to me," I said. He pushed himself off the desk and took a step toward me. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice, "you've been doing this for a long time, longer than anyone expected, and you've done it well. But things are changing." "What things?" I asked. "The market," he said quickly. "The scale of the business. The demands. It's not the same company it was 10 years ago." "That's true," I said, "because I built it into something larger." He exhaled again, more sharply this time. "And maintaining that requires a different kind of leadership," he said. "Faster decisions, more adaptability, less attachment. Attachment. To the company I built, to the people who depended on it, to the life Harold and I created. And you think I can't provide that," I said. I think Scott replied carefully that you're tired. I let that sit in the air between us. "Tired," I repeated. "Yes." "And you came to that conclusion based on what I asked." He hesitated. "Just long enough. Mom," he said, "you had that episode a few months ago." "Dehydration," I cut in. "That's what the doctor said." "Yes, but—" "No," I said, firmer now. "That's what the doctor said." Scott's expression tightened. "You're focusing on the wrong detail," he said. "It's not about that one incident. It's about the bigger picture. The bigger picture," I said slowly, "or the version of the picture you've been painting for everyone else." His eyes met mine, and for the first time that night there was no softness left in them. "You're being defensive," he said. "And you're being strategic," I replied. Silence. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Just exposed. I took another step closer. "Tell me something honestly," I said. "Did you plan to do this tonight no matter what I said?" Scott held my gaze. For a moment I thought he might deny it. that he would retreat into the version of himself that smiled and reassured and smoothed everything over. But he didn't. Instead, he said something else. Something that told me everything I needed to know. This was the cleanest moment to do it, he said. The words landed like a quiet impact. Cleanest, not best, not right. Cleanest, as in controlled, contained. Difficult to challenge. You chose a room full of people, I said slowly, so I wouldn't make a scene. I chose a room full of people, he replied, so it would feel real. Real. I almost laughed. And what happens if I say no? I asked. He didn't answer immediately, but I saw the calculation in his face, the weighing of options, the adjustment of approach. Finally, he said, "Then we talk about it later. Privately." And tonight, I pressed. Tonight, he said, we keep things positive. Positive. Of course, because the narrative mattered more than the truth. I studied him for a long moment. This man standing in front of me, my son, the boy I had once trusted to carry things forward when I was ready, and now he was trying to decide when I should be ready, without me. "You've already told people," I said quietly. "You've already started shifting things behind my back. You've already decided what this looks like." "That's not fair," he said. "Isn't it?" I asked. His jaw tightened again. "I'm trying to protect what you built," he said, "before it starts to slip. Before it starts to slip." There it was. Not concern, not care. Fear. Or maybe something closer to impatience. "You're not protecting it," I said. "You're positioning yourself." "That's not the same thing. It is when you do it without me." The words hung between us. Heavy. Unavoidable. Scott looked away first. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because in that moment I saw it clearly. Not confusion, not uncertainty, but intention. This wasn't something that had gotten out of hand. This was something he had chosen. Carefully, deliberately. And tonight, he had expected it to be easy. I stepped back, putting a small but deliberate distance between us. "We're not finishing this conversation here," I said. Scott looked at me again, something sharper in his expression now. "When are we finishing it?" he asked. I paused at the door, my hand resting lightly on the handle. "Not on your timeline," I said. Then I opened the door and stepped back into the noise of the party. The music was louder now, the laughter brighter, the illusion intact. But I carried something different with me as I walked back into that room. Not confusion, not fear, but clarity. Because whatever I had hoped to find in that conversation, an explanation, a misunderstanding, a way to soften what was happening, was gone. In its place was something much colder. My son hadn't stumbled into this. He had built it. And now so would I. When I stepped back into the main room, the party wrapped around me like nothing had changed. Music, laughter, champagne, everything still in motion, still smiling. Only I knew how carefully that motion had been arranged, and now I knew something else too. Scott wasn't improvising. He was following a plan, which meant I needed one of my own. I didn't go back to Vanessa. I didn't go back to the center of the room. Instead, I walked toward the far end of the hall where the lighting dimmed slightly and the noise softened just enough for a quiet phone call to go unnoticed. I pulled my phone from my clutch. There was only one person I trusted to understand the weight of what was happening without explanation. Martin Hale. He had handled Harold's estate when everything felt like it was falling apart years ago. He was precise, patient, and most importantly, he never let emotion cloud his judgment. If this situation had crossed into legal territory, Martin would see it before I fully did. My finger hovered for a second. Then I called. He picked up on the third ring. Edna. His voice was steady, mildly surprised. Everything all right? No, I said simply. It isn't. There was a pause. Not awkward. Assessing. Tell me, he said. I kept my voice low as I spoke, turning slightly so no one passing behind me could read my lips. My son just announced my retirement in front of a room full of people, I said, without my consent. There are documents prepared transfer of authority health-related language. I haven't signed anything. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, are you at the event right now? He asked. Yes. Good, he said. Stay exactly where you are and listen carefully. I leaned slightly against the wall, grounding myself. Do not sign anything. He continued. Not tonight. Not casually. Not as a gesture. Nothing. I won't, I said. Second, he went on. Do not let anyone isolate you into a private setting where they can pressure you. I thought of Vanessa's soft invitation. After cake, while everyone's here. I understand, I said. Third, Martin added, his voice tightening just slightly. If there are documents referencing your health, I want to see them. That language matters. A lot. It's vague, I said. Carefully vague. That's not a coincidence, he replied. That's strategy. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I thought so. Who else is involved? He asked. My daughter-in-law, I said, and possibly someone advising them. I'm not sure yet. You said health-related language, he said. Has anything changed medically that I'm not aware of? No, I said firmly. Nothing. A minor dehydration issue months ago, that's it. Then, that detail is being used, Martin said. Not reported. Used. The words settled heavily. Martin, I said quietly. This feels coordinated. It is, he replied without hesitation. Silence followed that. Not uncertain, just confirming. What do you need from me? I asked. For now, he said. Time, observation, information. I let out a slow breath. I can do that. I'm going to come by, he added. I blinked. You are, yes, he said. If this is unfolding publicly, then it needs to be witnessed publicly. I won't make a scene, but I want to be present. Relief flickered through me, small but real. Thank you, I said. I'll be there within 30 minutes, he said. Until then, stay steady. I will. And Edna, he added, his tone softening just slightly. This isn't something you handle alone. The line went quiet. I lowered the phone slowly. For the first time since Scott raised that glass, I felt something shift inside me. Not just clarity, support. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and turned toward the room again. And that's when I saw her. Renee Alvarez. She stood near the entrance, scanning the room with a confused expression, her brows drawn together slightly as if she wasn't sure she was in the right place. My chest tightened. Renee had been with me for nearly 15 years. She knew every corner of the company, every system, every person. If anyone would question a sudden retirement narrative, it would be her, which meant she had not been invited. I moved toward her immediately. Renee, I said softly. She turned her face lighting up in relief. Edna, she said. I wasn't sure if I should come. I heard about the party last minute from Claire, not from Scott, and it sounded like something important. Important. That was one way to put it. I'm glad you came, I said. She studied my face. Really studied it. And because she knew me so well, she saw it. What's going on? She asked quietly. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to choose my words carefully. This isn't what it looks like, I said. Her eyes sharpened instantly. I thought so, she replied. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the party moving around us like a separate world. I wasn't invited, she said after a second. That alone told me something was off. They didn't want you here, I said. Why, she asked. Because you would ask questions. Renee let out a slow breath. And what would I be asking? I held her gaze. Why there are documents prepared to transfer authority, I said. Why my health is being used as a justification. Why decisions are being made without me. Her expression shifted, not to shock, to anger. Quiet, controlled anger. When did this start? She asked. Not tonight, I said. That's all I know for sure. Renee glanced across the room, her eyes landing on Scott. He was laughing again. Performing. Do they think I wouldn't notice? She said under her breath. They think you wouldn't be here, I replied. That landed. Hard. She turned back to me. What do you need? She asked. The same question Martin had asked, but from a completely different place. Stay, I said. Watch. Don't confront anything yet. Renee nodded immediately. Of course. And Renee? I added, lowering my voice slightly if they tried to present this as a done deal. I need you to remember what you know. About the company. About me. Her jaw tightened. I've worked beside you for 15 years, she said. I know exactly what you're capable of. That steadiness, her certainty anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. Good, I said, because I was going to need that. Across the room, Vanessa's eyes found us. Her smile appeared instantly, polished, warm. But there was something behind it now. Calculation. She hadn't expected Renee to be here, which meant the balance in the room had shifted. Just slightly, but enough. Looks like we've been noticed, Renee murmured. Yes, I said quietly. Vanessa began walking toward us, her posture graceful, her expression composed. Scott followed a few seconds later. Of course he did. They moved together, as always, a united front. But now they weren't the only ones. I straightened my shoulders. Renee stood beside me, and somewhere on his way, Martin Hale. The plan Scott had built was still in motion, but it was no longer uncontested. And for the first time that night, I felt something close to control returning. Not fully, not yet, but enough to know one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end the way they expected. Vanessa reached us first. Renee, she said brightly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. What a lovely surprise. Renee didn't return the smile. Was it meant to be a surprise? She asked calmly. A flicker, quick, almost imperceptible, passed through Vanessa's expression before it smoothed again. Of course not, she replied lightly. Things came together quickly. You know how events can be. Yes, we both knew exactly how events came together. And this one had not been spontaneous. Scott stepped in beside her, his presence immediately shifting the air around us. Renee, he said, extending his hand. Glad you could make it. She looked at his hand for a second before shaking it. I heard about the party from Claire, she said. Not from you. Scott's smile held. "We've been moving fast on a few things," he said. "I meant to reach out." "Moving fast," Renee repeated. There was no accusation in her tone, but there was weight, enough that Scott felt it. "That's actually part of what tonight is about," Vanessa said smoothly, stepping slightly forward. "We're entering a new phase with the company, and we wanted to bring people together in a meaningful way. A new phase. There it was again, carefully packaged, emotionally softened." Renee glanced at me. Just once, but in that glance we understood each other completely. "This is about Edna." Vanessa continued, placing a gentle hand over her own chest, as if speaking from the heart. "Honoring everything she's done." "Is it?" Renee asked quietly. Vanessa's smile didn't falter. "Of course." I let the silence stretch just a moment longer before speaking. "I think I'd like some air," I said, turning slightly away from them. "Renee, would you walk with me?" Renee didn't hesitate. "Of course," she said. We left them there, Scott and Vanessa standing in their carefully constructed moment. I could feel their eyes on us as we moved through the room, watching, recalculating. The patio doors were open, letting in the warm Savannah night. The air outside was softer, quieter, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby. As soon as we stepped out, Renee turned to me. "This is worse than I thought, isn't it?" she asked. "Yes," I said simply. She crossed her arms, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the patio. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. Not every detail, but enough. The folders, the language, the doctor's note, the timing. And when I finished, Renee let out a long breath. "They're building a case," she said. "I know. Not a legal one. Not yet," she continued. "But a perception case. Something they can point to and say, 'This is already happening.'" "Yes," she shook her head slowly. "And they left me out," she added, "which means they know I wouldn't support it." "That's why you weren't invited," I said. Renee looked back at the glass doors where Scott and Vanessa were now speaking quietly to a small group of guests. "They've already started talking to vendors," she said. I turned to her. "What do you mean?" "I got a call yesterday," she said, "from one of our larger accounts. They mentioned the transition like it was already in motion. I thought it was a misunderstanding. It wasn't." I said. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." We stood there in silence for a moment, the pieces settling into place. Then Renee said something that tightened the situation even further. "Edna, have you heard of Derek Holloway?" The name landed immediately. "Vanessa's brother," I said. Renee nodded. "He's been around more lately," she said. "Not officially, but present. Sitting in on a couple of vendor calls, offering insight." "Insight? That's the man Tessa heard Vanessa arguing with," I said. Renee's eyes sharpened. "What did he say?" "Something about needing everything signed tonight," I replied. "While the right people are still here." Renee let out a quiet, humorless breath. "Of course he did." "You've worked with him?" I asked. "Not directly," she said, "but I've heard enough. He's polished. Careful. Knows how to position things so they sound inevitable." I thought of the memo, the phrasing, the way everything had been structured to feel like a natural progression instead of a forced shift. "That tracks," I said. Renee leaned lightly against the railing, her gaze steady now. "They're not just trying to take control," she said. "They're trying to make it look like the responsible thing to do, yes. So if you resist," she began. "I look unstable," I finished. She nodded. "Exactly." Inside, the music shifted into something brighter, livelier, as if the party had regained its momentum, or as if it had never lost it. "They've probably already drafted communication for after tonight," Renee said. "Emails, announcements, maybe even internal memos." "I saw something like that," I said. "A draft near the folders." Her jaw tightened. "Then this isn't just about you signing," she said. "It's about timing. They want to move fast before anyone can question it. Before I can question it." A door slid open behind us. We both turned. A man stepped onto the patio, tall, well-dressed, his movements controlled in that way that suggests he's always aware of how he's being perceived. Derek Holloway. He paused when he saw us just for a fraction of a second. Then he smiled. "Evening," he said. His tone was smooth, polished, practiced. "Evening," I replied. He stepped closer, slipping one hand into his pocket. "Beautiful event," he said. "You've built quite something, Ms. Franklin." There was respect in his voice, but it didn't feel like admiration. It felt like evaluation. "Thank you," I said. Renee said nothing. Derek's gaze moved between us, assessing. "Big night," he added. "Transitions like this don't happen often." "Transitions like this." I held his gaze. "Only when everyone involved agrees," I said. A small pause. Then a slight tilt of his head. "Of course," he said, but there was something behind that response. Something that suggested agreement was flexible. He looked toward the door, then back at me. "They're about to bring everyone together again," he said. "I imagine they'll want you inside." "They might," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Then he nodded once. "Enjoy your evening," he said, and just like that, he turned and stepped back inside. Renee let out a quiet breath. "I don't like him," she said. "No," I replied. "You shouldn't." We stood there a moment longer. Then I straightened. "Martin is on his way," I said. Renee looked at me, surprised but relieved. "Good," she said. "That changes things." "Yes," I said. It did. Because up until now this had been a performance, a carefully managed narrative. But soon, there would be someone in that room who understood exactly what they were trying to do, and how to stop it. I turned toward the doors. "Let's go back in," I said. Renee nodded, falling into step beside me. As we walked inside, the energy shifted again. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough. Because now, I wasn't just watching anymore. I was preparing. And somewhere behind the music, behind the smiles, behind the polished surface of the evening, the real confrontation was getting closer. The clinic sat on a quiet corner just off Abercorn, a low brick building I'd walked into months ago without a second thought. Now, as Martin parked and turned off the engine, it felt like the place where a story had been quietly rewritten without my consent. "Before we go in," he said, resting his hands on the steering wheel, "we're not here to accuse anyone. We're here to confirm facts." "I understand," I replied. He glanced at me, assessing. "You look steadier than you did on the phone last night." "I am," I said. "Clarity helps." He nodded once. "Good. Let's get it." Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper, familiar, unremarkable. A receptionist looked up as we approached. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," Martin replied, offering a professional smile. "We're here regarding patient records for Ms. Edna Franklin." Her eyes flicked to me, then back to him. "Do you have authorization?" she asked. Martin slid a document across the counter. "I do." She read it carefully, then nodded. "One moment, please." We were directed to a small office rather than the waiting area. It didn't take long before a woman in her 40s entered carrying a tablet and a slim folder. She introduced herself as Lydia Pierce, the clinic's administrative coordinator. "Ms. Franklin," she said gently, "it's nice to see you again." "How can we help?" I appreciated her tone, respectful, not condescending. "I'd like to review the notes from my last visit," I said, "specifically anything related to cognitive or functional concerns." Her expression shifted slightly, not alarmed but attentive. "Of course," she said. "There weren't any such concerns documented, but I can walk you through the chart." That sentence alone eased something tight in my chest. She opened the folder and began. "Your visit was on March 12th, she said. "You presented with dizziness, mild dehydration, and elevated stress indicators. The physician recommended hydration, rest, and follow-up if symptoms persisted." She turned the page slightly so I could see. "No diagnosis of cognitive impairment." She continued. "No recommendation for further neurological evaluation. No limitations on independent functioning." Martin glanced at me, then back at Lydia. "Have there been any updates or addendums to this record?" he asked. "No," she said. "The record stands as it was entered." I nodded slowly. "That aligns with my memory," I said. Lydia hesitated for a moment, then added, "There were a few follow-up inquiries after your visit." Martin's attention sharpened. "From whom?" he asked. She chose her words carefully. "A woman identifying herself as a family member contacted us twice," Lydia said. "She asked if the physician had noted any concerns about memory decision-making or long-term cognitive decline." "Vanessa." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "The truth," Lydia replied. "That there were no such notes. And was there any attempt to request changes to the record?" Martin asked. Lydia's expression tightened just slightly. "Not directly," she said, but she did ask whether the physician could clarify or expand the documentation to reflect potential early-stage concerns. My hands went still in my lap, and Martin prompted. "We declined," Lydia said. "We only document what is medically observed and supported. We don't speculate to fit a narrative." A narrative. There it was again. Carefully constructed. Externally reinforced. Internally hollow. "Were any records released?" Martin asked. "Yes," Lydia said. "A standard copy of the visit summary was requested and provided with proper authorization." I felt a flicker of irritation. "Authorization from me?" I asked. "Yes," she said, then paused. "Or from an individual listed as having permission to access your records?" My gaze shifted to Martin. "Scott," I said quietly. He gave a small nod. "We'll need to review the authorization on file," he said to Lydia. "Of course," she replied. "I can have that pulled for you." As she stepped out to retrieve it, the room fell quiet. I stared at the folder in front of me, at the neat clinical language, at the absence of anything that could justify what Scott had tried to present the night before. "He didn't get what he wanted," I said. "No," Martin replied. So he adapted, by implying what wasn't there. "Yes." I let that settle. It was one thing to be misunderstood. It was another to be repurposed. A few minutes later, Lydia returned with an additional document. "This is the authorization form," she said, placing it in front of us. I leaned forward. My signature sat at the bottom, clear, recognizable, but something felt off. Not wrong enough to call it a forgery, but familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. "I signed this," I said slowly. "Yes," Lydia confirmed. "It was submitted shortly after your visit. I traced the date with my finger. It aligned, but I couldn't remember the moment." "Do you recall signing it?" Martin asked. I remember signing general intake paperwork, I said, but not this specifically. Martin examined the document. It's broad, he said. Grants access to medical information to a designated family member. Which would be Scott, I said. Yes. I leaned back in my chair. So he didn't need to fabricate access, I said. He already had it. He had access to the facts, Martin replied, not to the interpretation he wanted. That distinction mattered. More than I had realized, because it meant this wasn't about creating false records. It was about reshaping real ones. Carefully, deliberately. Ms. Franklin Lydia said gently, if you're concerned about how your information is being used, you can revoke or modify this authorization at any time. I looked at her, at the quiet professionalism in her expression. I would like to do that, I said. Of course, she replied. As she began preparing the necessary forms, Martin leaned slightly toward me. This is good, he said quietly. Is it? I asked. Yes, he said, because now we know the foundation of their argument is weak, suggestive but not supported. I nodded. And we can prove that. Exactly. I exhaled slowly. The anger was still there. The hurt. But something else had taken its place. Structure. Understanding. Control. When Lydia returned with the revocation form, I signed it without hesitation. This time, I knew exactly what I was agreeing to. This will take effect immediately, she said. We'll update the file today. Thank you, I said. As we stood to leave, she added, for what it's worth. You presented as fully capable during your visit. Clear, decisive, independent. I met her gaze. I still am, I said. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, not because the situation had resolved, but because one piece of it had been stripped of its illusion. They tried to build a story around your health, Martin said as we walked toward the car. And it doesn't hold, I replied. No, he said. It doesn't. I paused beside the passenger door. They thought I wouldn't check, I said. They thought you wouldn't question it, he corrected. I gave a small, humorless smile. That part's over. Martin nodded. Yes, he said. It is. I got into the car, closing the door behind me. As he started the engine, I looked out at the quiet street, the ordinary morning unfolding around us. For months, maybe longer, something had been forming behind my back. A narrative. A plan. A quiet shift in how others saw me. But now I had seen it too. And once you see something clearly, it's very hard for anyone else to tell you what it is supposed to be. I rested my hands in my lap, steady, because whatever came next, I wouldn't be walking into it blind. By the time we left the clinic, the shape of things had changed. Not the facts, those had been there all along, but my position inside them. Before I had been reacting to something that felt sudden and disorienting. Now I was looking at a pattern, a sequence, a set of decisions that could be traced, challenged, and if I was careful, undone. Martin drove in silence for a few minutes before speaking. You have a choice to make, he said. I assumed as much, I replied. As, you can confront this directly, he continued. Call Scott out, draw a line, deal with the fallout immediately. And the other option, I asked. You let them believe you're considering it, he said. You slow them down. You gather more evidence. You choose the moment, not them. I turned slightly in my seat, watching the passing streets blur by. And in your professional opinion, I asked. In my professional opinion, Martin said they've already invested too much in their version of events to stop on their own. If you confront them now, they'll pivot, deny, reframe. And if I wait, you control the setting, he said. And more importantly, you control the narrative. Narrative. That word again. I nodded slowly. They wanted tonight because it made things look clean, I said. Yes. Then I take that away from them, I said. Martin allowed himself a small approving glance in my direction. Exactly. By the time he dropped me off at home, I knew what I was going to do. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to move forward without hesitation. Inside the house felt different than it had the night before. Quieter. Clearer. The remnants of the party flowers' gift bags, a few unopened cards, sat where they had been left like evidence of a celebration that had never truly belonged to me. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I reached for my phone. Scott answered on the second ring. Mom, he said, his tone careful, measured. I was just about to call you. Of course he was. I thought it would be better if I called first, I replied. A brief pause. How are you feeling? He asked. There it was again. Not what are you thinking? Not what do you want? How are you feeling? I've been thinking, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. That's good, he said cautiously. So have I. I don't want last night to turn into something unnecessary, I continued. Neither do I, he said quickly. Of course not. Conflict would complicate things. I understand what you're trying to do, I said. At least, I understand parts of it. I could almost hear him lean forward, and he prompted. And I'm willing to talk about it, I said. The shift on his end was immediate. Relief, subtle but unmistakable. I'm glad to hear that, he said. Really, Mom? I think this can be a positive step for all of us. Positive. I closed my eyes briefly. Not like last night, I added. No, he said quickly. Last night was just timing. Not ideal. Timing. Yes, I said. Exactly. Silence stretched for a moment. Then I spoke again. I'd like to do this properly, I said. With the right people present. Not in the middle of a party. That makes sense, he said. I want Renee there, I continued. Another pause. Short, but telling. Of course, he said. If that's what you want. It is. And Martin Hale, I added. This time the pause was longer. Why Martin, he asked. Because he understands the legal structure of the company. I said calmly, and if we're discussing any kind of transition that matters. He exhaled quietly. All right, he said. If that makes you more comfortable. Comfortable? Yes, I said. It does. And when were you thinking, he asked. I glanced around my kitchen at the sunlight filtering through the window at the ordinary calm of a morning that had nothing to do with what was coming. In a few days, I said. We can host something small, structured, a proper conversation. A dinner, he suggested. Yes, I said. A dinner. With a few key people, he added. Exactly. I could almost hear the satisfaction in his silence. He thought he was regaining control. Okay, he said finally. I can arrange that. No, I replied gently. I will. Another pause. Then, all right, he said. That was important. More important than it sounded, because it meant he was willing to let me set the stage, which meant he believed the outcome was already secured. I'll send you the details, I said. Looking forward to it, he replied. We ended the call. I set the phone down slowly, my fingers lingering against it for a moment longer than necessary. Then I turned and walked into the living room. Harold's photograph sat on the mantel exactly where it had always been. I stopped in front of it. "You would have seen this sooner," I said quietly. Maybe he would have. Or maybe he would have trusted just like I did. It didn't matter now. What mattered was what came next. I moved to my desk and opened my laptop. There was work to do, emails to review, messages to track, timelines to reconstruct. I started with the company account. Within minutes, I found what I was looking for. A thread, subtle but telling. Scott had reached out to several vendors over the past few weeks, using language that suggested preparation rather than speculation. Looking ahead to upcoming leadership adjustments, ensuring continuity during transition, positioning the company for its next phase. No mention of me stepping away directly, but enough implication that anyone reading between the lines would assume it was already happening. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing it. Then I opened another file. Internal communications, drafts. And there it was. A document labeled Franklin Event Supply, Transitional Leadership Announcement Draft. I clicked it open. The language was polished, professional, carefully balanced between respect and inevitability. It praised my years of service, acknowledged my decision to step back, introduced Scott as the acting head, outlined a smooth, confident future. No conflict, no uncertainty, just progression. I closed the document slowly. This was what they had been building toward. Not just a moment, a narrative. One that would outlive the party. One that would define how everyone saw what had happened. Unless I changed it. I reached for my phone again and dialed Renee. She picked up immediately. "I was hoping you'd call," she said. "We're doing this in a few days," I told her. "A formal dinner. Scott thinks we're discussing transition." "And we're not?" she asked. "We are," I said. "Just not the way he expects." She was quiet for a second. Then, "Good," she said. "I'll need everything you have." I continued. "Vendor calls, internal shifts, anything that feels off." "You'll have it," she said. "And Renee," I added. "I need you there, not just as staff." "I understand," she said. I ended the call and sat back, my thoughts settling into place. This wasn't about reacting anymore. It wasn't about stopping something mid-motion. It was about stepping into the same room they had prepared and changing what happened inside it. Because they had built their plan on one assumption, that I would either agree or break. They hadn't considered a third option, and that was their mistake. I looked at the calendar on my screen and selected a date. 3 days. Enough time to prepare, not enough time for them to adjust. I sent the invitations. Then I closed the laptop. The house was quiet again. Still, but no longer uncertain. Because the next time we all sat down together, it wouldn't be their version of the story unfolding. It would be mine. The dinner took place 3 nights later at my house. Not at a restaurant, not in a neutral space. Here, where every wall held a memory, every room carried the quiet authority of a life lived fully and honestly. If Scott had chosen the party because it gave him control, I chose this setting for the same reason. Only this time it was mine. I kept the guest list small exactly as planned. Scott and Vanessa, Renee, Martin Hale, Derek Holloway, and 2 longtime vendors who had worked with us for years, people who understood the company beyond surface-level impressions. Not a crowd, not an audience, but witnesses. By the time everyone arrived, the table was set, the lighting warm but not soft enough to blur expressions. I didn't want anything hidden behind atmosphere. Scott was the last to walk in. He paused just inside the doorway, his eyes moving across the room, taking in the arrangement, the people, the subtle shift from social gathering to something more deliberate. "Nice setup," he said, his tone light but measured. "Thank you," I replied. Vanessa stepped in behind him, her smile already in place. "It feels intimate," she said. "That was the idea," I answered. We sat. No music, no distractions, just the quiet clink of cutlery as dinner began. For a few minutes, conversation stayed on safe ground, whether recent events, a vendor update here and there. Scott led most of it, slipping easily into the role of host, even though this was my home. He needed that. Control even in small ways. Vanessa supported him seamlessly, redirecting topics, smoothing pauses, keeping things light. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension building. Everyone at that table knew this wasn't just dinner. We were waiting for the shift. It came sooner than Scott expected. "I think we should talk about why we're here," I said, setting my fork down gently. The room stilled. Scott leaned back slightly, nodding. "Of course," he said. "That's what we're here for." Vanessa placed her hand lightly over his, a subtle gesture of unity. Renee didn't move. Martin simply watched. Derek folded his hands in front of him, expression neutral. I looked at Scott. "You mentioned a transition," I said. "At my birthday," his jaw tightened just slightly. "Yes," he said. "I did. And you presented it as something already decided." I continued. "I presented it as something we've been moving toward," he corrected. "Without my agreement," I said. A pause. Then, "We've had conversations," he said. "Not decisions," I replied. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "Edna," she said gently, "we're not trying to take anything away from you. This is about supporting you, making sure everything you've built continues to thrive." Renee let out a quiet breath. "Then why wasn't I included?" she asked. Vanessa turned to her, still composed. "We were planning to bring you in," when Renee interrupted. Another pause. Scott stepped in. "We wanted to make sure the structure was clear before expanding the conversation," he said. "In other words, Renee said you wanted it to look settled before anyone could question it." The words landed cleanly. No accusation, just truth. Derek shifted slightly in his chair. "That's not a fair characterization," he said. "It's an accurate one," Renee replied. I let the moment settle before speaking again. "There are documents," I said, "prepared in advance, referencing a transfer of authority." Scott nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Drafts. To help guide the discussion. Drafts that imply I'm stepping down due to health concerns," I said. This time he hesitated. "Not imply," he said carefully. "Acknowledge. Acknowledge what I asked." "The reality," he said. "The reality," I repeated. I turned slightly toward Martin. "Would you like to clarify that I asked?" Martin set his glass down calmly. "I visited the clinic with Edna this morning," he said. "There is no medical basis for any claim of cognitive or functional decline." Silence. Sharp. Immediate. Vanessa's hand tightened slightly on the table. Derek's expression shifted just enough. Scott didn't look at me. He looked at Martin. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm not suggesting anything," Martin replied. "I'm stating a fact. The documentation does not support the narrative you've been referencing." The word hung in the air again. Narrative. Scott exhaled slowly. "This isn't about a diagnosis," he said. "It's about observation, patterns, long-term sustainability." "Then why reference a doctor at all?" I asked. No answer. "Because there wasn't one that would hold." Vanessa stepped in quickly. "We're not trying to mislead anyone," she said. "We're trying to ensure the company is protected." From what Renee asked. No one spoke. Because the answer from me couldn't be said out loud without exposing everything else. I leaned forward slightly. "You've been contacting vendors," I said, looking directly at Scott. "Preparing them for a transition." "It's called planning," he said. "It's called positioning," I replied. Derek shifted again. "We advised early communication to avoid disruption," he said. "Advised?" I repeated. "Yes." "So you are involved," I said. He held my gaze. "Yes." There it was. No more hiding behind implication. I nodded slowly. "Good," I said. "Then we're all being honest." Scott's patience began to thin. "Mom," he said, his tone tightening, "this doesn't need to become adversarial." "It already is," I said. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Vanessa's composure flickered for the first time. "We're family," she said. "Yes," I replied. "Which is why this matters." Scott leaned forward now. "Then let's talk about what matters," he said. "The future of the company. Its growth. Its stability." "And your role in it," I added. "Yes," he said. "Finally." Honesty. Clear. Direct. I nodded. "Good," I said again, because this was exactly where I needed him. Not in performance, not in pretense, but in truth. Around us, the room felt different now. No longer polite, no longer balanced, but open, exposed, and just beginning to tilt. Because everything they had built, every assumption, every carefully placed word, was now being questioned. Out loud. In front of the people they had hoped would validate it. And for the first time since that glass shattered at my party, I could feel the direction changing. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to know we were no longer playing by their script. No one reached for their glass. No one moved. The room had settled into something too tight for comfort, too honest for pretense. Scott leaned forward, his elbows brushing the edge of the table, his fingers interlacing slowly as if he needed something to hold on to. "Then let's be direct," he said, his voice no longer warm, no longer softened for an audience. "This company has outgrown the way it's being run." There it was. Not concern, not care. A verdict. I met his gaze without blinking. "Say what you mean," I said. His jaw tightened. "I mean it needs leadership that can keep up with where it's going," he said. "Not where it's been." A faint shift moved through the room. One of the vendors glanced down at his plate. Renee didn't move at all. "And you believe that leadership is you," I said. "I know it is," he replied. The confidence in his voice wasn't new, but now it wasn't disguised. Vanessa placed her hand lightly on his arm. "Scott." "No," he said, not taking his eyes off me. "We're past softening this." He turned slightly toward the table as if addressing more than just me now. "We've all seen it," he continued. "The delays, the hesitations, the way decisions take longer than they should." Renee's expression sharpened. "That's not what I've seen," she said. Scott didn't look at her. "That's because you're used to it," he replied. The dismissal was quiet, but it landed. Used to what Renee asked, to a system that's been held together by habit instead of evolution, he said. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. Because this tone, this framing wasn't new. It was something that had been building. Quietly, privately, until it found a place to stand. And you've been preparing for this, I said. Yes, he said. No hesitation. No denial. Behind my back, I added, I've been preparing for what's necessary, he replied. The room went still again. Even Derek didn't speak. Even Vanessa stayed silent. Because Scott had crossed a line, not just in action, but in admission. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. Then let's talk about necessity, I said. Martin shifted beside me, his presence steady, watchful. You've contacted vendors, I continued. You've drafted internal communications. You've prepared documents referencing my health. Scott's gaze flickered just for a second. Language, he said. Not claims. Language that implies something untrue, Martin said calmly. Scott's eyes snapped toward him. We're not discussing legal semantics, he said. That's exactly what we're discussing, Martin replied. Because that language carries legal weight. Vanessa stepped in, her voice softer now, more urgent. We're not trying to misrepresent anything she said. We're trying to ensure continuity, stability. At my expense, I said. No, she said quickly. With your support. I didn't give it, I replied. Silence. Sharp. Derek cleared his throat lightly. If I may, he said, his tone measured, controlled. The intention here was never to override you. It was to guide a transition that would eventually need to happen. Eventually. On whose timeline, I asked. He hesitated. Just long enough. That's something we hoped to align on, he said. Align. Another word designed to soften something hard. I turned back to Scott. You said something in my study, I said. His expression shifted slightly. About that night being the cleanest moment to do this. Vanessa's head turned toward him. Derek's posture tightened. Renee's eyes narrowed. Scott didn't look away. Yes, he said. No apology. No correction. Just confirmation. And what exactly did you mean by that, I asked. His voice lowered. Controlled. It meant that presenting it publicly would make the transition smoother, he said. Less resistance, less confusion, less resistance. The words echoed. You mean less resistance from me, I said. He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. The truth was already sitting in the room, exposed. Unavoidable, I leaned back slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then I spoke again. You weren't trying to include me, I said. I was trying to move things forward, he replied. At my expense, I repeated. At the company's benefit, he said. There it was. The justification. The moral pivot. As if one could exist without the other. And where exactly do I fit into that future, I asked. Scott hesitated. Just briefly. Then, you step back, he said. You stay involved in a limited capacity. Advisory. Symbolic. Symbolic. The word landed heavier than anything else he had said, because it revealed everything. Not just what he wanted to do, but how he saw me. Not as a leader, not as a decision maker, but as something to be acknowledged, and then moved aside. Renee let out a slow breath. You're replacing her, she said. I'm continuing what she started, he replied. No, she said. You're taking it. The room held its breath. Vanessa's composure cracked for a moment. That's not fair, she said. What's not fair, Renee replied, is pretending this is about care when it's about control. Derek shifted again. This is becoming emotional, he said. It is emotional, I said. Because it's personal. I looked at Scott. At what point, I asked quietly, did you decide I was no longer capable? His gaze held mine. Steady. Unyielding. It wasn't one moment, he said. It was a pattern. A pattern you constructed? I said. A pattern I observed, he corrected. Then why didn't you come to me directly? I asked. I did, he said. No, I said. You suggested. You implied. You positioned. I leaned forward again, my voice calm but firm. You didn't have a conversation with me, I said. You built a case around me. Silence. Deep. Final. Scott's shoulders stiffened. I did what I thought was right, he said. For who I asked. He didn't answer immediately, and in that hesitation the truth surfaced. Not for the company. Not for me. For himself. For the future, he said finally. I held his gaze. The future you wanted, I said. He didn't deny it, didn't soften it, didn't reframe it, because now there was nothing left to hide behind. The room had shifted completely, no more illusion, no more performance, just truth. Raw, unfiltered, and irreversible. I sat back slowly, my hands resting lightly in my lap. The weight of the moment settled over all of us, because what had been implied was now spoken, what had been planned was now revealed, and what had been hidden was now impossible to ignore. No one spoke for a long moment, the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled but demands to be understood. Scott sat across from me, his shoulders squared, his expression set in something that looked like resolve. Not anger, not even defensiveness. Conviction. And that more than anything else told me how far this had gone. I folded my hands in my lap, steadying myself not because I was unsure, but because I wanted every word that came next to land exactly where it belonged. Then we're clear, I said at last. Scott didn't respond, but his eyes didn't leave mine. You believe the company needs new leadership, I continued, and you believe that leadership should be you. Yes, he said. No hesitation, no apology, just certainty. And you were prepared to make that happen, I said, whether I agreed or not. A flicker crossed his face. Small, but real. I was prepared to move forward, he said. With or without me, I said. Silence. Again, this time heavier, because there was no way to soften it anymore. I nodded once. Thank you, I said quietly. The words seemed to catch him off guard. For what he asked. For finally being honest, I said. I let that sit for a moment before continuing. Now, I will be honest with you. The room seemed to tighten again, not with tension this time, but with anticipation. Because everyone at that table understood this was the point of decision. I straightened slightly, my posture settling into something that felt both familiar and firm. For 35 years, I said I built this company. Not alone, but with your father. Every contract, every client, every risk, every mistake. I paused, letting my gaze move briefly across the table, Renee steady and silent, Martin watchful, the vendors attentive, Vanessa and Derek still. And when your father died, I continued. I didn't walk away. I didn't sell. I didn't step back. I looked at Scott again. I stayed. I adapted. I learned how to lead without him. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Do you know why I asked? He didn't answer. Because this company isn't just an asset, I said. It's a responsibility. To the people who work there. To the clients who trust us. To the life your father and I built together. I let out a slow breath. And to myself. The last words settled deeper than the rest, because they were the ones I had almost forgotten. I am not tired, I said. Scott's jaw tightened. I am not confused, I continued. Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair. And I am not incapable of making decisions about my own life or my own company. Silence. Complete. Final. I reached for the glass of water in front of me, took a small sip and set it back down with care. Which means, I said, there is no transition. Scott leaned forward. Mom? No, I said, holding up a hand. Not sharply, not aggressively, but firmly enough that he stopped. You don't get to announce my future for me, I said. Not in a room full of people. Not in private. Not at all. His expression hardened. This isn't about control, he said. It is exactly about control, I replied. Derek shifted, preparing to speak, but Martin spoke first. Given the circumstances, Martin said calmly, we will also be reviewing recent communications made on behalf of the company. Scott's eyes snapped toward him. What does that mean? He asked. It means, Martin replied, that any representation of leadership changes made without Edna's consent may have legal implications. Vanessa's composure cracked again. That's unnecessary, she said quickly. No, Martin said. It's appropriate. I let the legal weight settle where it needed to. Then I spoke again. Effective immediately, I said, my voice steady, your access to executive decision-making is suspended. Scott stared at me. You can't be serious, he said. I am, I replied. This is my company, I continued. And until I decide otherwise, every decision runs through me. His chair scraped slightly against the floor as he leaned forward. You're overreacting, he said. No, I said. I'm responding. To what he demanded. To a plan you executed without my knowledge, I said. To documents prepared in advance. To conversations held behind my back. To a narrative built around my health that has no basis in fact. Each point landed, one after another. Unavoidable, and most importantly, I added to the assumption that I would either agree or be too confused to stop you. Silence. Vanessa looked down at the table. Derek's expression had gone completely still. Renee didn't move, but I could feel her support beside me like something solid. Scott exhaled sharply. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he said. No, I replied. You made it bigger the moment you tried to take it without asking. That hit. I could see it. Not in his words, but in the way his shoulders shifted, in the way his gaze faltered just for a second. You're my mother, he said, his voice lowering. And you're my son, I replied. The words hung there. Heavy, complicated. True. And that's the only reason this conversation looks the way it does right now, I said. He looked at me sharply. What does that mean? He asked. It means I'm not turning this into something destructive, I said. It means I'm not dragging you through something you won't recover from. Vanessa looked up, then her expression hopeful just for a moment. But I wasn't finished. It does not mean I continued that I'm going to ignore what you did. The hope vanished, replaced by something else. Reality. Scott leaned back slowly, his eyes searching mine. So what happens now? He asked. There it was, the question beneath everything. I took a breath, then answered. You step back, I said. His expression darkened. You review your role in this company, I continued, and you decide whether you want to be part of it or take a different path. You're pushing me out, he said. No, I replied. I'm giving you a choice you didn't give me. Silence, long, heavy, final. Around us, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been decided. Not by him, but by me. I stood slowly, my chair moving back with a quiet sound that seemed louder than it should have been. This conversation is over, I said. No one argued, no one protested, because the shift had already happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And as I walked away from that table, from my son, from his plan, from the version of my life he had tried to write for me, I felt something return that I hadn't realized I had lost. Not control, not power, something deeper than that. Authority, my own. The house was quiet the morning after the dinner. Not the uneasy quiet of something unresolved, but the kind that comes after a storm has already broken and passed through. The kind that leaves things altered, not destroyed, but undeniably changed. I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the early light stretch across the countertops. For the first time in days, my mind wasn't racing ahead of me. It wasn't trying to predict the next move or brace for the next conversation, because the hardest part had already happened. The truth had been spoken out loud in front of witnesses without softness or illusion. And once truth exists in the open, it cannot be folded back into silence. Renee arrived just after 8. She didn't knock twice. Just once, firm and familiar the way she always had. When I opened the door, she looked at me for a long moment before saying anything. "You slept?" she asked. "A little," I said. "That's something." She stepped inside, setting her bag down by the door like she'd done 100 times before, though usually it had been at the office, not here. We moved into the kitchen together, and I poured her a cup of coffee without asking. "You handled that exactly the way it needed to be handled," she said, leaning lightly against the counter. I let out a quiet breath. "I handled it the only way I could," I said. "That's usually the same thing," she replied. We stood there for a moment in silence. Then she said, "He didn't see that coming." "No," I said. "He didn't." Renee nodded slowly. "He thought the decision had already been made," she said. "Yes, and that you just needed to catch up to it." I gave a small humorless smile. "That sounds about right." She took a sip of her coffee, then set the cup down. "There's already been movement," she said. I looked at her. "What kind of movement internal?" she said. "Word is spreading. People are asking questions." "Good," I said. "They're confused," she added, "because what they heard before doesn't match what's happening now." "That's also good," I said. Renee studied me carefully. "You're not worried about that?" "No," I said. "Confusion means the narrative isn't holding." She nodded. "Fair point." There was a pause before she spoke again. "Scott came by the office early this morning," she said. I didn't react immediately. "What did he do?" I asked. "He tried to act like nothing had changed," she said. "Gave a few instructions, asked for updates. And I said, I told him I'd need to confirm everything with you first," she replied. A small, quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. And how did he take that? "Not well," she said. But he didn't push it. Not in front of everyone. Of course he didn't. He was still managing perception, still trying to hold on to the version of control he had built. "That will shift," I said. "Yes," Renee agreed. "It will." We moved into the living room, the conversation following us naturally. "I've already started reviewing the vendor communications," she said. "There are a few that need to be addressed directly." "I'll handle those," I said. "I thought you might." She sat down on the edge of the chair, her posture relaxed but her focus sharp. "There's something else," she added. I waited. "Vanessa called one of the suppliers this morning," she said. "Tried to reassure them that everything is still on track." I let out a slow breath. "On track," I repeated. "As if nothing has changed," Renee said. "As if she can still control how this unfolds," I replied. Renee nodded. "Do you think she believes that she asked?" "No," I said. "I think she's trying to buy time." "For what?" "For Scott to recover his position," I said. "Or at least, to soften the fallout." Renee leaned back slightly. "Do you think he will?" she asked. I considered the question, not as a mother, but as someone who had just seen him clearly for the first time in a long time. "I think he'll try," I said. "And do you think he can?" she asked. I met her gaze. "No," I said. The certainty in my voice surprised even me, but it was there, solid, unshaken, because this wasn't about one decision or one conversation. It was about trust, and once that's broken in the way it had been, it doesn't come back easily, or quickly, or without consequence. Renee nodded slowly. "Then we move forward," she said. "Yes," I replied. We spent the next hour going through details, operational updates, staff concerns, client communications, everything that grounded the company in reality away from the version Scott had tried to construct. And as we worked, something else began to settle into place. Not just control, not just clarity, but direction. Because for the first time since Harold passed, I wasn't just maintaining what we had built. I was reshaping it. On my terms. Later that afternoon, after Renee left, I found myself back in the living room, alone. The house quiet again. I walked over to the mantel where Harold's photograph still stood. The same one. The three of us. A different time. A different version of what I thought the future would look like. "I didn't see it," I said quietly. Not as an excuse, just as truth. "I wanted to believe it was care," I continued, "not control." I let out a slow breath. I won't make that mistake again. The room held the words, didn't answer. Didn't need to, because the answer wasn't out there anymore. It was here, in the choices I was making, in the boundaries I was holding, in the life I was reclaiming. I turned away from the photograph and moved toward the window. Outside, the street looked exactly the same as it always had. Neighbors walking their dogs, cars passing by. Ordinary, steady, unaffected by what had happened inside these walls. And for the first time in a long while, that steadiness didn't feel distant. It felt possible. Not because everything had been resolved, not because the damage had been undone, but because I was no longer standing in uncertainty. I had seen what needed to be seen. I had said what needed to be said. And I had done what needed to be done. Whatever came next, whether Scott chose to step back or push further, whether Vanessa tried to reshape the situation or retreat from it, whether the company faced questions or transitions, I would meet it from a place of clarity. Not fear, not hesitation, and certainly not silence. Because if there was one thing I understood now more than ever, it was this. No one gets to decide your ending for you. You. Not your children, not your circumstances, not even your past. That belongs to you, and only you. 3 months later, I hosted another gathering. Not a party, not a performance. Just a table, a few chairs, and the kind of people who show up because they choose to, not because they were invited into a narrative. We set it up in the backyard this time, early evening. The savannah air still warmed, the light softening as the sun began its slow descent. There were no banners, no speeches prepared, no carefully placed folders waiting to be opened. Just food conversation and the quiet understanding that everything here was real. Renee arrived first, carrying a small dish she insisted on bringing, even though I told her not to. "I don't trust gatherings without food contributions," she said dryly. I smiled. "Old habits," I replied. "Good ones," she said. One by one, the others came. A couple of longtime clients who had stayed with us through every transition. A neighbor who had checked in on me more than once over the past few weeks. One of the warehouse supervisors who had quietly told me after everything unfolded that he had always trusted my leadership even when others started whispering. Not a large group, but the right one. We sat together as the sky shifted from gold to blue, the conversation easy, unforced. No one tried to steer it. No one tried to shape it into something meaningful. It already was. At some point, someone asked how I was doing, not in the polite way people ask when they don't really want the answer, but directly, honestly. I took a moment before responding. "I'm steady," I said. And that was the truth. Not perfect, not untouched, but grounded. Renee glanced at me, a small nod of recognition passing between us. "Steady is good," she said. "Yes," I agreed. It is the company had settled into its new rhythm faster than I expected. Not without questions, not without a few difficult conversations, but with clarity. That made all the difference. We restructured parts of the leadership not to replace me, but to support the growth Scott had been so eager to claim. Renee stepped into a more formal operational role, one that reflected the work she had already been doing for years. We brought in outside oversight, not because I didn't trust the people around me, but because I had learned what happens when structure is left open to interpretation. Control doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes dressed as help. Sometimes it calls itself care. And if you're not paying attention, it settles in before you even realize it's there. I wasn't going to let that happen again. Someone asked about Scott. It wasn't awkward, just inevitable. I set my glass down slowly. "He wrote to me," I said. Renee's gaze lifted slightly, and she asked. I looked out across the yard for a moment at the quiet movement of the trees in the evening air. "It wasn't an apology," I said. "Not really." A few of them exchanged glances. "It was an explanation," I continued, "about pressure, about expectations, about feeling like he had been waiting too long." "That doesn't justify it," one of the vendors said. "No," I replied. "It doesn't." I let the silence sit for a moment before adding, "But it explains it." And that mattered, not because it erased what he had done, but because it made it human, flawed, complicated, real. "Did you respond?" Renee asked. I nodded. I did. "What did you say?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. I told him I wasn't ready to talk about forgiveness, I said, but I was willing to leave the door open for accountability. Renee's expression softened slightly. "That sounds like you," she said. "It sounds like someone who learned something," I replied. And I had, more than I expected, more than I wanted, but enough to change how I moved through the world. We didn't talk about Scott much after that, not because the subject was closed, but because it didn't need to dominate the space. He was part of my life, but he was no longer defining it. As the evening deepened, the conversation shifted again to work, to families, to small things that felt important in a way that had nothing to do with control or power. At some point I stood, not to give a speech, just to say something. "I want to thank you all for being here," I said. The group quieted naturally, not out of obligation, but out of attention. "Not just tonight," I continued, "but over the past few months." I glanced at Renee. "At the times when things weren't clear," I said, "when questions were easier to avoid than to ask." My gaze moved across the table. "You stayed," I said simply, and that meant more than anything else. "People talk about loyalty," I continued, "like it's something you're supposed to give without thinking, but real loyalty, it shows up when things get uncomfortable, when the story stops making sense." I paused. "And you ask anyway." A quiet stillness settled over the group. I didn't lose everything that night, I said, even though it felt like I might. I thought back to the sound, the sharp crack of glass against the floor. The moment everything shifted, I lost an illusion, I said. And that I realized now had been necessary, because without that moment, I might still be standing in that room smiling politely, letting someone else decide what came next. Instead, I was here, present, clear, uncompromised. I picked up my glass again, lifting it slightly. "To truth," I said. "To truth," Renee echoed. The others followed. The sound of glasses meeting was softer than the one that had started all of this, but stronger, because this time nothing was breaking. The evening wound down slowly after that. People left in their own time with quiet goodbyes and warm embraces. No one rushed. No one lingered out of obligation. When the last guest was gone, I stayed outside for a while longer. The night had settled fully now, the air cooler, the sky deep and still. I sat in one of the chairs looking out over the yard, and for the first time since my birthday, I felt something I hadn't expected to return so quickly. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being resolved, but the kind that comes from knowing you're standing in your own life again, fully, completely, on your terms. I thought about that moment, the glass breaking behind me, how sharp it had sounded, how sudden, how disruptive. At the time, it had felt like something was being shattered. Now I understood what it really was. Not destruction, but interruption. A pause in something that was moving too fast in the wrong direction. A chance to see, to question, to stop. I leaned back slightly, letting the quiet settle around me, because sometimes the moment that feels like everything falling apart is actually the moment everything begins to come back together. There's something no one tells you about getting older. They tell you to slow down, to rest, to step back. They say it gently, kindly, sometimes even lovingly, but what they don't tell you is this. Sometimes those words don't come from care. Sometimes they come from someone else's need to move forward without you in the way. And if you're not careful, you can mistake control for concern. I did. I wanted to believe my son was looking out for me, that the shift I felt wasn't real, that the unease in my chest was just me being sensitive, emotional, protective of something I should have been ready to release. But here's what I learned. You are allowed to question what doesn't feel right, even when it comes from your own family. You are allowed to say no, even when everyone else in the room is expecting you to say yes. And you are allowed to define your own timing, your own future, your own ending. Age doesn't take that from you, not unless you give it away. And love, real love, doesn't rush you, corner you, or decide for you. It respects you, even when it's inconvenient, even when it has to wait. So I'll ask you something. If you were in my place, standing in that room, hearing your life being decided for you, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have waited and chosen your moment? tell me in the comments. I read every one, and if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own strength or something you've gone through, take a moment to like and subscribe. And wherever you are right now, I'd love to know what time is it there, because somewhere someone else might be standing at the edge of a moment just like this, wondering if they still have a choice. You do. Always.